Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life is religious art of the highest degree. First published on the 24th of December, 2023. I cannot pretend to be some kind of cineast. From Sight and Sound's 2002 list of the greatest films of all time, I have seen a measly 52 of them. Pitiful, I know, especially for someone who has intellectual pretensions. But if there were one film that I feel I could perhaps write something of value about, glean something that could contain at least a granule of truth, then it would be the film ranked number 133 on that list. A film I have seen at least a dozen times because it is a great favourite of mine, namely Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life from 1946. The film is based on a short story published in 1943 called The Greatest Gift by the now little-known author Philip Van Doren Stern. While credit has to be given for this progenesis, further comparisons between the two are hardly warranted. Firstly, because Van Doren Stern's work is artistically atrocious, and secondly because of the major plot differences. Whereas most of Capra's film is concerned with narrating George's life up until his suicide attempt, The Greatest Gift starts off right at the bridge with George ready to jump into the freezing waters below. Capra's decision to let us spend over an hour becoming acquainted with George and the other characters surrounding his life was a wise one, because in being launched in medias res into The Greatest Gift, there is not much sympathy to be held towards anyone in the story. Many of the things that underpin George's heroism in the film, his unrequited sacrifices, his building and loan bank keeping the town from collapse, and the monstrous antagonism of a villain in the form of Henry F. Potter, are all missing here. And conversely, there are details in the short story that are entirely absent in the film. For example, in The Greatest Gift, the guardian angel, who is nameless, has instructed George to act like a furniture brush salesman in order to gain access to people's homes. When he sees that the people who are supposed to be most dear to him don't recognize him, there is almost no dismay on George's part. The interaction is so unsympathetic and cold that George in the end comes across as almost being more interested in selling the goddamned brushes than anything else. Here we see it in the scene where he goes to visit his mother who never was. Quote, his mother, who was waiting in the hallway, obviously did not recognize him. George opened his sample kit and grabbed the first brush that came to hand. "Good evening, ma'am," he said politely. "I'm from the World Cleaning Company. We're giving out a free sample brush. I thought you might like to have one." End quote. Politely aloof. She tells George that his wife who never was, Mary, has married and had 2 children with a former rival. Another major digression from the film where Mary has become an old maid. The sigh he lets out upon hearing this has no pain in it whatsoever. It could just as well be one of joyful relief, for all I know. Quote, "I remember a girl named Mary Thatcher. She married Art Jenkins, I heard. You must know them." "Of course," his mother said. "We know Mary well." "Any children?" he asked casually. "2, a boy and a girl." George sighed audibly. End quote. And just take a look at his careless reaction immediately after hearing from her that his brother Harry has died. Quote, "I'm sorry," he said miserably. "I guess I'd better go. I hope you like the brush, and I wish you both a very Merry Christmas." End quote. Now compare that with the same scene in the film. The sequence here is despairingly nightmarish. From the first tender "mother" that George utters, to her meanness and suspicion, to the framing of George's frantic expressions and the eeriness of the music, Capra captures so strongly what must only be the maddening anguish of realizing that you are trapped in a world where your very essence has ceased to exist.
Well?
Mother.
Mother? What do you want?
Mother, this is George. I thought sure you'd remember me.
George who? If you're looking for a room, there's no vacancy.
Listen, please help me. Something terrible's happened to me. I don't know what it is. Something's happened to everybody. Please let me come in and keep me here until I get over it.
Get over what? I don't take in strangers unless they're sent here by somebody I know.
What? Well, I know everybody you know. What, your brother-in-law, Uncle Billy.
You know him?
Well, sure I do.
When'd you see him last?
Today, over at his house.
It's a lie. He's been in the insane asylum ever since he lost his business. And if you ask me, that's where you belong.
There are many ludicrous interpretations of this film out there that seem to pay not only total disregard to the film itself, but also one of Capra's comments that he made about it. That with it he wanted to, quote, combat a modern trend toward atheism, end quote. I think there is a whole lot to be unpacked in that remark, and it is my sincere belief that It's a Wonderful Life ought to go down as one of the great religious works of art from the 20th century.
You sent for me, sir?
Yes, Clarence. A man down on Earth needs our help.
Splendid. Is he sick?
No, worse. He's discouraged. At exactly 10:45 p.m. Earth time, that man will be thinking seriously of throwing away God's greatest gift.
Oh, dear, dear, his life. Then I've only an hour to dress.
Yet, in spite of the angels, the Christmas setting, and the miraculous intervention to save George's life, the film is not explicitly Christian or even religious for that matter. We risk confounding the film by juxtaposing it alongside works we otherwise think of when hearing the term religious art. Works like paintings, music, or poems that come in the form of biblical depiction, worship, or mystical experience. The atheism that Capra laments here is not a lament for a decline in church attendance or a statistical change in the answers registered during the last US Census, but rather a complaint against a society for whom he feels life, and the individual life in particular, is no longer meaningful, and therefore no longer sacred. Over a year ago, I posted a series of 3 essays on Leo Tolstoy's non-fiction, in the last of which I went through his radical theory on art. For Tolstoy, the highest manifestation of the arts was the religious, which for him did not signify doctrinal exhibition or divine adoration, but was rather contained in works that express the virtues of humility, self-renunciation, and the affirmation of the universal brotherhood of man. Religious because they affirm the divinely intended purpose of life, pointing upward, in pointing down, to what will help usher in the kingdom of God here on earth. Under such criteria, Tolstoy notoriously rejected most works of art ever produced, including the novels he himself wrote. It's a Wonderful Life, however, is a film that explores such themes and has a morally profound message of real urgency. What he gets at when talking about religious art is what I feel It's a Wonderful Life is, and as such, I would imagine that had he lived long enough to be able to watch it, then it would have made the cut. The Gospel of Bailey. While I above all want to stress George Bailey's human, everyman qualities, his virtues and his shortcomings, one cannot deny that he overall comes across as a Christ-like figure in the film. Like the Gospels, It's a Wonderful Life is broadly the story of a man carrying a cross not chiefly burdened with personal woes, but with those of an entire community, and a story preoccupied with the suffering that he goes through because of this sacrifice. The most climactic scene depicting this anguish comes towards the end, when the bank he runs has lost $8,000 and George, having taken leave of his family after a fit of rage, finds himself in Martini's bar, praying to find some way out of his dire predicament.
God. Oh, God. Dear Father in heaven, I'm not a praying man, but if you're up there and you can hear me, show me the way. I'm at the end of my rope, right? Show me the way, oh God.
Are you all right, George? Want somebody to take you home, huh?
Why you drink so much, my friend? Please go home, Mr. Bailey. This is Christmas Eve. Bailey? Which Bailey?
This Mr. George Bailey.
Compare this with Christ's agony in Gethsemane as depicted in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, verses 32 to 36. The similarities between the two scenes can hardly be coincidental. The prescient sense of death, the hopelessness, the desperation of the prayer immediately answered in the negative, Christ being delivered to the authorities, George being knocked down to the floor. Quote, "They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I pray.' And he took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. 'My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death,' he said to them. 'Stay here and keep watch.' Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and prayed that, if possible, the hour might pass from him. 'Abba, Father,' he said, 'everything is possible for you, and take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will.'" End quote. And just as the Gospels build up to the central event of Jesus' death and resurrection, so does It's a Wonderful Life work towards one focal point, George's death and resurrection-like experience of getting to see what the world would have looked like had he never lived. Resist not evil. The film spans over 2 decades of George's adult life, and while the filmmakers have done their best to depict the aging of the characters over time, George and Mary look more or less the same at the end as parents to 4 children as they did when they were youngsters dancing the Charleston at the high school ball. While such a minor defect is easily overlooked, the agelessness of one of the characters in particular is completely fitting, that of the villain, Henry F. Potter. This is what he looks like back in 1917, when George is still a child.
Mr. Potter, what makes you such a hard-skulled character? You have no family, no children. You can't begin to spend all the money you've got.
Oh, I suppose I should give it to miserable failures like you and that idiot brother of yours to spend for me.
And this is what he looks like 3 decades later, in 1945.
You misplaced $8,000.
Yes, sir.
Have you notified the police?
There have been no attempts to make him look older whatsoever. I cannot think of any more contemptible antagonist in a film that I have seen. There is nothing good in him, and as such, nothing human. Since there's nothing human, nothing that could age, nothing even that should die. When I initially saw this film, I saw in him an inhuman monstrosity, a vampire of sorts, but the more I watch it, the more of an abstraction he becomes. The more he seems like the embodiment of the idea of evil. Besides his agelessness, there are other details that suggest this. As we saw in the first of the extracts above, he has no family, he has no children, and he has no need or use of material possessions. His contribution in World War II is as the head of the draft board, and therefore the one most responsible for sending young men to their death in war. He delights only in what ought not to be. He puts a price on human life, and is the one who directly goads George into committing suicide by pointing out that his life has no value.
I've suddenly become quite important. Well, what kind of security would I have, George? Have you got any stocks?
No, sir.
Bonds? Real estate? Collateral of any kind?
I have some life insurance. $15,000 policy.
Yes, how much is your equity in it?
$500.
$500. And you asked me to lend you $8,000. Look at you. You used to be so cocky. You were going to go out and conquer the world. You once called me a warped, frustrated old man. What are you but a warped, frustrated young man? Miserable little clerk crawling in here on your hands and knees and begging for help. No securities, no stocks, no bonds, nothing but a miserable little $500 equity and a life insurance policy. You're worth more dead than alive. Why don't you go to the riffraff you love so much and ask them to let you have $8,000? You know why? Because they'd run you out of town on a rail. But I tell you what I'm going to do for you, George. since the state examiner is still here, as a stockholder of the building and loan, I'm going to swear out a warrant for your arrest. Misappropriation of funds, manipulation, malfeasance. All right, George. Go ahead. Go. You can't hide in a little town like this. Bill, this is Potter.
His abstractness is further supported by the fact that no one can lay hands on him. Potter is an old invalid. It would not be hard for someone to wring his neck or plunge a knife in his chest. George himself could have done it and spared the town of his persistent torment. Yet no one touches him. It is as though they physically couldn't, because he is only the embodiment of something that never perishes. And the more I watch this film, the more I think that he will surely outlive all the characters in the story. Is it not so significant, therefore, that Potter is undefeated at the film's end? As heartwarming and life-affirming as that end is, we must remember that the very next day, Potter will be going back to hanging over George and the town like a plague again. And in its relationship to the concept of evil embodied by Potter, It's a Wonderful Life can be seen as offering a Christian perspective. How should one confront evil? Or by not resisting it, by turning the other cheek, Matthew 5:39, by loving one's enemies, Matthew 5:43-44. While George has many heated arguments with Potter throughout the film, he comes to practice the Christian ethic most perfectly at the end, when he has been given his life back. Bear in mind that Potter has just driven him to the verge of suicide and issued a warrant for his arrest. And how does George respond? By banging on the window to his office and crying out,
Hey! Merry Christmas, Mr. Potter! Happy New Year to you! In jail! Go on home, they're waiting for you.
Hark, the kingdom cometh. With the exception of the first scene where the angels talk to each other, the first 3/4 of the film or so, up until Clarence intervenes to save George's life, are very realistic. They not only accurately depict certain historical events, the Depression and World War II, but the story and the grievances of the characters are very mundane, common to any community. What's so clever about this is that it makes the fantastical, supernatural, and even at times facetious aspects of the final part perfectly believable.
I jumped in the river to save you so I could get my wings. Uh-oh. Somebody's just made it.
Made what?
Every time you hear a bell rings, it means that some angel's just got his wings.
Look, I think maybe you better not mention getting your wings around here, but...
Why, don't they believe in angels?
Yeah, I believe.
Oh, why should they be surprised when they see one?
He never grew up. He's, how old are you anyway, Clarence?
293, next May.
From that final sequence, I want to focus on the very famous last scene. One thing that is strange about it is that it is hardly a resolution of the central problem presented throughout the film, that is, of George's inability to follow his dreams. Were this your typical plot, then George as the protagonist ought to finally get what he has always wanted, and Potter as the antagonist receive his comeuppance. None of that happens. What is instead unravelled is a moral revelation that negates, that forgives, perhaps, everything that has happened in the film. It is not a comment on the American dream and its possibility. If it does say anything about it, then it is only that it was entirely misguided from the get-go. Life is a wonderful thing, not because it can be a means of self-enrichment and aggrandizement, but because it fundamentally means something for other people. Though it ought only be George who has had this epiphany at the end, it is as though the whole town has had it too, and in the magic of the last scene it feels as though a new world, a new order, is being welcomed into being, where man embraces man in universal love, and where the institutions of authority and oppression have been dissolved. One of the most touching details in this scene, and in all the film for me, is when the bank examiner leaves money at the collection basket, and above all, when the district attorney's sheriff tears up George's arrest warrant. That would be a serious criminal offence on his part, that it is fitting because it is as though all these tools for domination and control, both fiscal and judiciary, have become totally irrelevant in the world to be. Yes, the town does come together to bail George out, and then some. But at this point money is of no value to him anymore. George couldn't care less about the $8,000. He has just shaken the bank examiner and the sheriff's hand, crying out,
Well, hello, Mr. Bank Examiner. How are
Mr. Bailey, there's a deficit.
I know, $8,000.
George, I've got a little paper.
I'll bet it's a warrant for my arrest. Isn't it wonderful? I'm going to jail.
The wonder of life is beyond a price tag, and so the riches mentioned by George's brother Harry in one of the final lines of the film is certainly not meant in a literal sense.
I could. The fool flew all the way up here in a blizzard.
Harry, how about your banquet in New York?
Oh, I left right in the middle of it. As soon as I got Mary's telegram. Good idea, Ernie. A toast. To my big brother, George, the richest man in town. That's a Christmas present from a very dear friend of mine.
Look, Daddy, teacher says every time a bell rings, an angel gets his wings.
That's right. That's right.
Attaboy, Clarence.
Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to you all.